Mark Freeman. He's the founder and executive director of the Institute for Integrated Transitions, which is a non-governmental organization that has celebrated its 10th anniversary recently as a global peace building innovator. So yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today, and feel free to share your screen.
Thank you so much for joining on a Friday afternoon or morning, or evening, depending where you are. Thank you, Paulius, and your colleagues for this wonderful opportunity to spend the month here at the Paris Institute for Advanced Study to finish what I hope will be a prototype for a new negotiation model that I call fast-track negotiation. I'll, of course, say a little bit more about that in a moment. But what I wanted to do maybe before I present the arguments and the idea is really make a kind of confession, because I've been working for quite a long time now, broadly speaking, in two areas. One is negotiation, in particular negotiations to resolve political crises or armed conflicts. And I've also been involved for a very long time in working on transitions. Thus the name of my institute, Institute for Integrated Transitions. And I've been having a bad feeling for quite a lot of time now, quite a number of years, that I couldn't pinpoint when it came to negotiation. A feeling that something is broken, a feeling that the people with whom I and my colleagues were working were not buying what we were selling in terms of the right way to negotiate. And just a feeling generally of mismatch between what is very apparent in terms of the landscape of conflict, political conflict and armed conflict, the way that things have evolved, grown far more complex, far more urgent, the speed at which conflicts deteriorate. It's all been happening before our eyes for quite a lot of time. But I think partly because I'm in the field, I've promoted some of the ideas behind the model that I would now argue is largely obsolete, a slow model of negotiation. I had a hard time seeing it. Maybe some of you have had that experience as well, where you're so deep in something. I mean, I don't know if it was, in fact, Marshall McLuhan, but often there's a quote attributed to the political scientist Marshall McLuhan along the lines that I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. But sometimes, you know, there's a kind of, as I say, it's a discomfort more than anything else, and almost a cognitive dissonance. And that led me, long story short, to a realization, which is that along with the exogenous problems of conflict in the world that have nothing to do per se directly with negotiation, these are just problems of evil and bad actors and violence and all of these things. The negotiation model, the negotiation paradigm that we have, the assumed and accepted wisdom about the correct way to negotiate is wrong. It's a mismatch for the reality all around us. A second part of the realization, though, is that when I thought about the principles and the practices and the assumptions that underlie the model that we have, which is very idealistic in terms of what is supposed to happen when a negotiation takes place. There's a sort of Hollywood feel to it. I also realized that this model is very slow, whereas, as I mentioned a moment ago, the pace of events, the speed of deterioration of conflicts, the urgency on the ground is much greater today. The complexity is much greater today than it was, I would argue, several decades ago when this paradigm kind of took shape. I'm mostly talking about in the 1990s, when it sort of installed itself as an approach, as a paradigm for how we negotiate. And so I set about to think about this, and again, I have the luxury of developing and finalizing, I hope, the prototype for this, not as a cure-all, but I hope as a way of expanding the way that we think about, the way that we organize negotiation. Because again, in short, the model we have is too slow. It is like a product market mismatch. They do not fit. And the good news, I believe, is that there's an opportunity. There's certainly a need, but I think there's an opportunity, and that's my goal to finish it this month, is to develop a prototype for a fast track model of negotiation. Something that matches the moment, something that can match everything we see around us. So let me just go very quickly through the claims or the arguments that substantiate what I'm working on and what I'm presenting. So the first part is the argument that there is a paradigm, that there is an accepted wisdom about the correct way to negotiate. I don't have time to present all the evidence for that, but I've been fortunate to have CMS law firm and a large group of Harvard students and various others, including some colleagues who have assisted very extensively with the research to back up this claim. And essentially, it's just all around us. It's in guidelines, it's in documents, it's in courses, it's everywhere. And there's a set of principles and practices that you see reflected repeatedly that overlap across different institutions, governments, and organizations. I'll just mention a couple. In the work I've done so far, I mean, I've identified 11 core principles and practices of the paradigm that we have, which, as I said, in aggregate, produces very slow negotiation. But just to mention a couple, I mean, one is the notion of inclusivity. Inclusivity is a beautiful, wonderful idea. In the context of a negotiation, the idea is that unlike the way that for centuries, probably millennia, peace and political settlements were negotiated, they were done by elites behind closed doors. The paradigm shift that I'm referring to, which brings us to the paradigm we have today, includes ideas that are like a pendulum swing reaction to that. And one of the core principles is that peace negotiations and political negotiations should be inclusive. Lots of people should be involved. They should be more participatory. And again, all else being equal, it's a beautiful and noble ideal. I've promoted it myself, but it also slows things down. The more people are involved, again, all else being equal, the slower you are moving. There's a lot of complexity, I can tell you from experience, when you expand the participation, when you expand inclusion. It makes things slower. It may have some benefits. It definitely produces slower negotiation, notwithstanding the urgency that you're dealing with. A similar kind of principle or practice that informs the paradigm, the accepted wisdom of the correct way to negotiate, is the idea of broad or comprehensive agendas. And that's where I was referring to Hollywood a little bit cynically, I admit, but the idea is that everything should be on the agenda. Don't do the quick, dirty deals of the past, of the bad old days and the bad centuries that preceded today's accepted wisdom. Make sure that you're dealing with root causes and everything that has taken place, all the problems, put them into the agenda, because anything less will just be incomplete and it won't work. Again, a very logical, even ideal or principle. In the context of negotiation, one of the direct effects is to slow you down, not speed you up. So those are just two examples. I say there's lots of others. There are also premises or assumptions that underlie this paradigm. Every paradigm is built upon a set of factual and other assumptions and premises, some ideological as well. And again, there's a set of them that I'm including in the prototype in the paper that I'm doing. But one of those, just to give one example, is the idea that once you have a negotiation, almost by magic, the society is aware that the parties to a political or armed conflict are sitting down, they're negotiating, that somehow, by virtue of the existence of the negotiation table, there will be a moderating effect on the conflict actors themselves, and a kind of moderating or holding effect on the conflict outside of the negotiation room. And somehow, by virtue of the existence of the negotiation, this will happen. There are a set of other premises, but to make a long story very short, the core premise, if you have a model of negotiation, when you add up all the premises and the principles and the practices that underlie it, and a kind of monomania of the correct way to negotiate, when you have that in place, you end up in this mismatch situation to the extent you're dealing with urgent context, where you can see the flames rising, the violence growing, the dangers increasing all around you. But then you look in your negotiation toolbox and you find essentially one tool or one paradigm, and it's slow. So what I'm developing is a prototype for something I call fast track negotiation. Now, fast track negotiation, if it's going to be over time, it has to be tested, it has to be peer reviewed, it has to be evaluated. All those good things need to happen. But we first need a prototype, which we do not have. We have examples, perhaps some of you know of, or even worked on negotiations that you considered to have worked quickly, that happened fast. There are examples. What there is not is a prototype. What there is not is a model. So everything that is done quickly is done on a more ad hoc basis, and it's done in the shadow of the paradigm that we have, and is judged accordingly. Fast is considered bad. People wouldn't say, I love slow negotiation, but they should, because that's what they actually love. That's what I loved for a very long time. But I think, as I say, I think with the fast track model, for me, logically, the starting point is to develop a prototype. So what would be examples of some of the principles and practices that would inform, logically, a fast track model that is a match for the moment, that is a match for the landscape of today, that is a match for the demand that we see for solutions that work, where people can see themselves using negotiation as a useful tool to prevent or resolve serious problems and conflict. So one is, to draw the contrasts. I mentioned that in the paradigm we have, the slow paradigm, inclusivity is a core principle. It's a cardinal principle, almost like a form of, there's almost religious adherence that some people have to it. There's a lot of passion attached to this issue, and rightly so. But when it comes to negotiation, if we want to move quickly, a logical organizing principle when it comes to this variable, inclusive or not, for a fast track, it needs to be more of the logic of inclusive enough to reach a settlement. Let's not forget why we negotiate. We don't negotiate to improve the quality of our democracy through the negotiation. We negotiate to get a settlement which we can implement, and through implementation can produce better conditions. But we actually have to get to a settlement. And in general, in the vast majority of cases, that means that there's a need to move quickly. So an inclusive enough logic is again, it's a sensible corresponding organizing principle if your aim is to achieve faster negotiation. Similarly, when it comes to the breadth of the agenda or the level of detail in final agreements, again, when it comes to fast track, the logic is going to be necessarily more oriented towards tighter agendas, shorter final settlements, framework agreements, partial agreements. These will be the currency among many other principles and practices of the fast track model. And in short, all of it will, again, need to be based on a set of corresponding assumptions, some of which I've mentioned here, about need, about the conflict landscape of today and tomorrow, all the trend lines that are obvious, I think, to those who work in this field. They're all around us. But essentially, the fast track model is principled on the idea that time is not on our side. Time is short. That when we announce a negotiation, if it's announced at all to the public, it may not be, but if it is, it won't be assumed that the mere announcement of the fact that a negotiation is happening, it will not be assumed that it will have a moderating effect on the parties in the negotiation room or the society outside of that room. Quite the opposite. In a fast track model, the announcement of a negotiation, the existence of a negotiation, will increase the incentives and the appetite for spoilers. It will increase conflict risks. It will increase existential anxieties. That's just an example of one of the premises or assumptions that should inform how we work so that we can get out of the situation we are in, which is what I mentioned before. It's a literal mismatch between the model we have and the situations that we face, their urgency, their complexity, and the speed at which they deteriorate. Now, you might be thinking, well, are you telling me that we don't already have a fast model? And I regret to say that no, we do not. We only have fast examples. And there are some, but essentially the absence of a model is leading to a lot of ad hoc experimentation. I personally believe deeply, profoundly in rigor, methodology. I believe deeply in this, and I think it's critical when you consider what is at stake in the kinds of negotiations that I and my colleagues work in. There's too much at stake. You can't be loose. You can't be too loose or too unrigorous or unmethodical. So we don't have that. You may also be thinking, well, fast sounds unrealistic. I mean, conflicts are so complex. I mean, is it realistic to be able to negotiate quickly? My answer to that is yes, if you have a different set of operating premises, if you take urgency seriously, and if you have a prototype that you can test and use so that we have something that works in the vast majority of situations. Whereas I said, right now we are in a situation of offering up a paradigm that no one is buying, not even myself. And I'm supposed to be doing the selling. So that's another kind of doubt you might have as you listen to me. Similarly, you might be thinking, well, if it's quick, is it going to be sustainable? I think the way that I think about that is I would rather have a negotiation model that leads to settlement rather than to nothing, which is the vast majority of results that we get in negotiation, which are non-results. There's nothing to sustain other than the negotiation process itself. So between those choices, and those are the real choices, at this stage, I think it's fair to say the question of sustainability is legitimate. The challenge, which I aim to meet with the prototype of a fast track model, is to establish how it can be organized, how you can negotiate quickly, potentially through multiple deals that are reached quickly, rather than a single limited agreement one time. There can be multiple quick or fast track negotiations, which measurably improve the situation. And then you've shrunk the conflict. Then you have reshaped the conflict for the better, as opposed to what we can say at this point, just objectively, looking at the evidence, looking at the data, that you have nothing. There's no settlement to implement or sustain. That's the real choice that we're faced with. So in conclusion, I just wanted to welcome, first of all the doubts, concerns, skepticism you may have about this idea. It will definitely help me, as Paulius knows, and as he mentioned, I have a few weeks left before I publish this prototype. But I really feel very, very strongly that it's just no longer acceptable to offer up such a poor model, such a poor paradigm, such a badly fitting paradigm for the people who are experiencing, in some cases, at very extreme levels of chaos and conflict and violence in their lives. And negotiation can be a better friend to them. We need to give negotiation a chance. And right now, we're not doing that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark.